Elizabeth Henning is an ADGA judge and linear appraiser and has judged and/or appraised thousands of goats in every state except Hawaii. In this presentation, she describes the American Dairy Goat Association Genetics Performance Programs and how it has helped improve the dairy goats. The American Goat Federation, AGF, was organized as a non-profit national association in 2010 to represent the interests of all organizations and producers engaged in the production and marketing of goat milk, meat, fiber, pack goat, and grazing services across the United States.
It's been a long process for the American Dairy Goat Association. We first began production testing for dairy goats in the late 1960s, and the type appraisal program under the old classification framework began in the 1970s, with the linear appraisal portion of our type program beginning in the late 1980s. So we do have a lot of years of information, and it's certainly helping our producers at this standpoint. The American Dairy Goat Association has been in existence since 1904, and our mission statement here, as you can see, involves providing the genetic information and management services to our dairy goat breeders. As of the end of December, we had over 18,000 members of the American Dairy Goat Association, and thousands of animals are represented in our performance programs. Okay, we have several tools that our breeders use to provide assistance in selecting breeding stock and improving their herds. The first is the Dairy Herd Improvement for the Registry, DHIR, which is the milk production part of it. The second is linear appraisal, which is the type part of our performance programs. We also use Sire summaries that are produced in conjunction with USDA and the Council of Dairy Cattle Breeders. Our performance reports, and again, we have a cooperative arrangement with the Council of Dairy Cattle Breeders to do our genetic evaluations, and we also provide DNA testing. Our genetic improvement programs for dairy goats are one of the things that make the ADGA registry unique. These programs are available to all of our membership, regardless of which breed they are working with. We feel that, and we have proven that accumulating data on pedigrees, milk production, type, and auxiliary traits from as many animals as possible provides for accurate genetic evaluations. So the more animals that are participating in our programs, the higher the reliability of our data, and the better our breeders are able to use this data to improve the genetics of their own animals. This makes it more sustainable and cost-effective of directing an individual breeder's goals that they wish to achieve. And again, we have a unique agreement with the Council of Dairy Cattle Breeders and the USDA to provide our genetic evaluations. First, I want to talk about milk production, and ADGA maintains production records in two separate volumes, the Advanced Registry volume and the STAR volumes. The Advanced Registry records are total lactation performance records for animals enrolled in the DHIR program. STAR records provide stars that may be earned at official ADGA one-day tests, which require 3 samplings, each 12 hours apart. You get an initial pre-test, and then 2 following tests, 12 hours and 24 hours after the first test, where milk samples are collected and then submitted for analysis of butterfat and protein. Also, The STAR program provides information that is based on pedigree or progeny. So DHIR, this is the registry form of the dairy herd improvement, and it's a commitment to production-related goals. This program includes year-round monitoring of milk volume, components, and herd health. So when you report on your monthly test, your monthly milk test, you can also report when animals were vaccinated, when they were bred, if a doe required more than one service, what the service sire is, all of those things that we can use to improve the information on the animals we're breeding. So these careful breeding decisions result in ADGA registered animals having records that are consistently higher than the national averages. Just a picture of one of our dairy goat herds. These are the DHIR breed averages for 2015, and these are based on ADGA individual doe records not corrected for age. So if you look down at the breeds in the left-hand column, followed by the number of animals on test. And these are animals that were on test from at least 275 to 305 days in milk. The mean age is standardized, the milk pounds, fat percent, protein percent, and energy corrected milk pounds, which is based on the baseline of 3.5% fat and 3.2% protein. So you can see that there is variability among the breeds in the percentages of fat and protein as well as the milk pounds. Now I should point out for those of you who are not familiar with the dairy goat breeds that the Nigerians are a dwarf breed. So their maximum size for a mature doe is 22.5 inches. So obviously the milk pounds there are not going to be comparable in terms of volume. But when you look at the differences in percentage of butter, fat, and protein, there are some differences there. I'm sorry this slide isn't better. This is a sheet that would be used on your test day, and in the far left-hand column is the identification of the animal. Previous test day data for milk pounds, butterfat percentage, protein percentage, and somatic cell information is then in the next two columns. The days in milk in the next column. Then as we move more to the center of the page, we have the age of the animals, if there's been any change in their status. For instance, if one has freshened, or if she's been sold, or she's died, or come into the herd as a new animal, you would see that in that column. Then we go over to the red column, which is shows their sample number, and every animal is identified. And in ADGA, animals are identified through tattoos. But then that tattoo may be linked to a visible tag. There has to be some sort of visible identification on each animal for the test day. And that is verified on the first test and any verification tests that may be necessary throughout the lactation. So that when the supervisor comes to the farm to do your first test of the season, then he or she will read the tattoo, verify the information matches that on the registration papers, and that the visible identification, either ear tag or neck tag, is also available, so that that information is maintained continually throughout the information that's collected during the lactation of each animal. Then the next two columns are the evening and morning milk production columns. And the milk is weighed, if you're on a DHIR standard test, the milk is weighed and sampled at the evening milking, and then 12 hours later at the morning milking, or whenever that time is. Those times are recorded. Lactation, you get back a Doe Page. Actually, you get this every month, but at the end of the lactation, it will show the completed lactation. And on this particular animal, we see that she is an older animal, so we have a number of lactations listed at the bottom. We see the amount of milk produced in each of those lactations, the percentage of butter fat. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you see the genetic information for her in terms of the PTA for milk and fat, her dam, and her sire. So then when we go to ADGA Genetics, and you can look up the performance on each doe. And this is an example of a production parameter on a doe. The first is the SG, means superior genetics. So in this case, this doe has been identified as a superior genetics doe, which means that she, at one point in her life, has been in the top 15% of her breed for either milk production or type evaluation. The fluid merit is in dollars. This is the amount of dollars that the dairyman could expect to have as a return. This is based on the dairy cattle formula, so the actual amount that you would expect for a dairy goat is going to be slightly different from this, but it certainly is an indication of where you are relative to the other animals in your herd with this particular animal. In this case, this information is based on one lactation, so obviously the reliability is not going to be as high as it will be when she's had 4 or 5 lactations down the road. At this point, her average standard milk is 3,822 pounds with 133 pounds of fat and 117 pounds of protein. The PTA is predicted transmitting ability, and this is based on her pedigree. And again, fat reliability, we see here 0.33, so relatively low reliability. PTA of 1.8 pounds of fat and 0.08% butter fat. Protein reliability, again the same, with a protein PTA and percent PTA accordingly. The predicted producing ability compared to her herd mates is going to be 430 pounds more than her herd mates. And you can see the fat, protein, and then the percentile rank for her breed. So this is the information that you can look up. This is public information. You can go and find this information for any doe that has been on test. We get the same information on bucks. Obviously, the information on bucks is based on their daughter's performance. So you will get the information that is based on how many daughters they have. Obviously, the reliability is going to be based on the numbers of daughters, the numbers of lactations they've had, the number of states in which those lactations have happened, because these data are controlled for environmental factors. So what happens in California may not happen in Mississippi, and it has to be standardized. Otherwise, if you're buying an animal from a herd in Alabama and that animal has reliability of a certain level or production at a certain level, you can expect that based on this, that reliability should translate to your herd because these data are standardized. They're controlled for those environmental differences. So elite bucks and does, again, this is based on the milk fat protein dollars that we talked about earlier. And they have to, this is an economic index that comes out of the CDCB genetic evaluations. And it's a single genetic measure for predicting the profit potential of future progeny. And again, this is found on the Doe sheets or at the CDCB website where we saw the information that I had printed out on the doe. We also get it for bucks. Elite does are in the top 5% of their breed nationally, and bucks are in the top 15%. And the elite lists are created twice annually following the summer and fall evaluations. Okay, so that's the milk part of it. Now we get into the type part of it. And again, as I said, ADGA began with a classification program that was very similar to the old and based on the Holstein program that began in the late 40s and 50s. And we started using it in the early 70s. And then as the dairy cattle evolved to a linear system, we adopted that system beginning in the late 1980s. All dairy goats are evaluated using our unified scorecard. So we do not separate out, we don't have evaluations for in type for Nubians as opposed to Saanens or as opposed to Nigerian. They are all evaluated identically under the unified scorecard. The only place where it's different is, for instance, in a senior doe, a milking doe, 5% of the unified scorecard is allotted for head and breed characteristics. So the important part is the function. So the amount of credit given to the structure of the head and is going to be more important than the individual breed characteristics. Really the only time as a judge or an appraiser that I consider breed characteristics to be very important is when there's a disqualification problem. Otherwise, everybody's evaluated exactly the same way. And of course, the goal of the unified scorecard is geared toward function. So we want to produce the type of animal that can function efficiently over a long, productive lifetime. All right, so just briefly a look at the scorecard, different point categories for senior does, junior does, and bucks. A junior doe is any doe under 24 months of age that has never freshened. And again, the points allotted to the udder traits. So when the linear program was identified and we were trying to decide which traits we were going to use, there were three general criteria that we used to develop the linear program. First of all, the trait must have some economic value. Either it was thought to increase longevity, which reduced the culling rate, or to increase production. And secondly, the trait must be heritable. And heritable enough so that progress or improvement can be made at an acceptable rate through the selection of sires. This is a sire proving program. Both of these programs, the DHIR program and the linear appraisal program, are sire proving programs. Thirdly, the trait had to be possible for those of us who work as appraisers to assign a value to the trait with acceptable repeatability among appraisers. So every year we get together and we spend a weekend and we look at a whole bunch of goats and we score them and talk about them. Our performance programs manager, Lisa Shepard, has analyzed the data from the previous season so that if there are particular areas where there seems to be more variability among appraisers, those are the things that we concentrate on at our refresher session. If you do not attend a refresher session as an appraiser, you cannot work that year. So our controls for identifying these traits accurately and with repeatability year after year and among appraisers is pretty darn high. We have good standards. In addition to the linear traits, we have kept a piece of the old classification program, and we include the structural categories, and those are based on the appraiser's evaluation of each animal relative to that piece of the scorecard. And they're ranked from poor to excellent, so they get a letter score. The only portion of the linear program that feeds into the Sire summaries are the linear traits and the final score of the animal. So our evaluation of the structural categories provides additional information to our herd owners, but it does not contribute to the genetic piece of the program. So these are the traits, and when we are looking at these animals, you can see that the trait ranges from 5 to 45 for each of the traits. There is no value attached to any of those numbers. We are simply looking at the animal and recording on our sheets where that animal falls within the range. So there is no value attached, positive or negative, to any of the linear trait numbers. This is our report form, and on the left we would have the animal identification, tattoos, year and month of birth, and then we have the linear traits, the structural categories, any miscellaneous traits. For instance, if an animal has extremely spread toes, she would get a code of 10 in that category if we feel that it is affecting function. And again, all of this is geared toward function. Then the 4 major categories, the animal is given a letter designation from poor to excellent, depending upon how close to the ideal the appraiser evaluates her. 90% or above would be excellent. 85 to 89% is in the very good category. 80 to 84% in the good plus category. A 10-point category of acceptable. And then below acceptable we have poor or fair and poor, which would be less than 70% of what we would expect. When we're doing the appraisals throughout the whole linear evaluation piece and the structural category piece, we do not consider the age or any condition situations that the animal may have. So up until that time, up until we get to the final 4 categories and the final score, we don't know whether an animal is 4 years old or 6 years old or a yearling. We're just recording what we see. Okay, this is an example of a sheet that a herd owner would get back once the data has been entered in the office and sent back. And again, you can see there the goat tattoo information. I blocked out the names, but the goat tattoo information, the lactation number, the date of birth, the numbers in the linear appraisal categories, the linear traits, followed by the letter evaluations in the structural categories. Finally, if there's any miscellaneous trait that the appraiser wants to evaluate, in this case there is 1. The 68 means that this goat had a blemished udder. In fact, she lost half of her udder as a 2-year-old, but we were still able to evaluate the structure of the mammary system based on half the udder and the final scores. Where you see 2 scores at the final end along with the structural categories, that means that the animal has been evaluated at age 5 or older, and the lower score would be the permanent score. So once an animal is evaluated at age 5 or older, he or she will have a permanent score. If they are evaluated at an older age, that score can either go up or go down, obviously, but the permanent score will remain. So if the score goes up, the owner can request that the new higher score be reported as the permanent score. If it goes down, they can stay with their 5-year-old score. So these are type parameters for a doe, and again, this is something that's public information off ADGA Genetics. So with the type program, we saw with the production program that the information is breed specific. With the type program, it is not breed specific. So all of the type information is for all dairy goats. So, and it's important to look at this information. You can see that what the trait average has been for this doe. So if a doe is scored as a yearling milker and 4 or 5 more times during her lifetime, then those trait average scores will be averages for all of her appraisals, not just the last one or not just her mature one. And again, these are just on the linear traits. So on the ADGA, if you're a member of ADGA, you can subscribe to our subscription reports. And this is an example of an information that you might be able to get on one of your animals. And you can see you can see the lactation information at the top of the sheet. This doe wasn't on test until she was 4 years and 10 months old, so she was almost a 5-year-old. But then when you look down at her linear information, you can see that she was actually a milking doe from the time she was a yearling. But for some reason or another, she wasn't able to be on test. Some of our people live in very remote areas, and it's difficult for them to find a DHIA supervisor that can come and do the test for them. And until fairly recently, it was owner sampler programs, which require higher levels of verification, were not available for DHIR information. They are now, but you do have to have a higher level of verification to get that, and they're not eligible for top 10 records. But this is the kind of information that you can get back on your animals. So these performance records of production, the linear traits, and pedigree are needed for us to develop a complete picture of the individual animals in our herds. And when you have used the linear program, for instance, for a long period of time, and you understand the linear trait categories, that you know what a number 40 means in rear udder height, and you can get a visual picture of the animal just by looking at the numbers from the linear appraisal scores. So this is what is our ADGA performance pedigree, and you can see along here several of these animals have been DNA typed, and that is designated there. The production and type information for each animal is there. So our performance pedigrees provide factual, verified information of conformation and production, the correlation of yield and type with our Council Dairy Cattle Breeders evaluations, and the participation in our programs provides the production information, type evaluation. There's automatic screening for our Sire development program. evaluation for elite buck and doe qualifications, pedigree correlation again with CDCB, sire summaries, indexes of yield and type, the predicted transmitting ability, which is based on pedigree, and the production type index, which is based on evaluations. Eligibility for superior genetics, and predicted performance or reliability for the next generation. One of the programs that we started working on in the late 1980s was the Young Sire Development Program. And again, these animals have to qualify on both production and type to be eligible for the Young Sire program. They are ranked in two ways, emphasizing either production or type, but they have to qualify in both areas above 0 for them to be eligible for the program. Unfortunately, one of the downsides of the dairy goat industry, and one of the things that Diane was talking about, is because dairy goat herds tend to be relatively smaller than a lot of meat goat herds, is that getting reliability and getting that information out, getting bucks used over a large number of herds in other geographic areas is a real challenge for us. And so it's difficult unless you're using artificial insemination or are willing to do a lot of trading with other herds to get proof on your bucks. And sometimes a buck may be several years old or dead before we have the kind of proof that would make him desirable in the market. Then the Superior Genetics Program, again, as I mentioned, the animal must be in the top 15%, in other words, the 85th percentile ranking or higher of their breed according to the Production Type Index, at least once during their lifetime. Once they have achieved the superior genetics level, that remains on their pedigree. So a doe that earns her SG as a 2-year-old will always have that information on her pedigree. We also offer DNA testing programs, and that testing is available at a reduced contracted rate for our members. We contract through the Veterinary Genetics Lab at UC Davis for this testing. And at the present time, 3 different tests are available. Additionally, if a member participates regularly in our production and type programs, we have a program called ADGA Plus, and ADGA Plus members have additional reductions in DNA testing rates if they participate in that program. So obviously, DNA typing is a permanent record of identification of any individual animals. Your breed improvement and selection programs require accurate pedigree information, and DNA information contributes to the reliability of that information. On our national sales, most of us who have animals in national sales automatically do the DNA typing of those animals so that the parental verification goes along with that. It can also increase an animal's worth and improves our reliability or integrity of our business transactions. Also, it can and has been used to trace stolen animals, and obviously we are hoping to use it in the future for hopefully as we get into more availability of genomic traits, not only for disease, but also for our production traits. And again, the Europeans are a bit ahead of us on some of these things, but they will come to us. One of the things that the ADGA board, we've been working on it as I was chair of our Genetic Advancement Committee, working on getting the board to put in place a genetic defect program, and we finally got that passed by the board last fall. The only current genetic defect identified in dairy goats is G6S, and that is a metabolic defect that's primarily so far been identified in Nubian and Nubian cross animals. I did put a little brochure that the International Nubian Breeders have put together. There were a few copies that I put on the back table back there by your sign-in sheet. There's also additional information on the International Nubian Breeders website as well as on the ADGA website. This disease is inherited in an autosomal recessive fashion, which means that 2 carrier animals will produce, statistically, 25% affected animals. The real issue with G6S, and I think the reason that we had such a hard time getting it through, was because carrier animals exhibit no symptoms whatsoever. And homozygous positive animals may live to be several years old before they ever exhibit any signs. Those signs are frequently can be mistaken for other diseases, or they're just failure to thrive. And therefore our identification of those animals is probably far below what may be the actual tested percentage, which is very low at this point. But since if you have 2 carrier animals and you don't know that they're carriers, you can have that trait come up and then continue to impact your breeding program as you go down the line. Even though this defect has been primarily identified in Nubian and Nubian cross animals, there are animals of other breeds that have been identified as carriers. Another trait that we're looking at, it's not a genetic defect, but a protein polymorphism. And again, this was identified in Europe and they have used it a lot. Animals that have strong casein alleles tend to produce milk that has a higher clotting factor and thus a little bit higher cheese yield in research that has been done. There's also research that suggests that animals with low alleles may produce milk that is less allergenic. And so there are several of us that are looking at this allele in our genetics to whether we want to produce lower levels or higher levels. We can have our animals tested for these alleles and help us to make breeding decisions as to what direction we may wish to go. If our major market in breeding stock or in our own production line is for cheese yield, then we may wish to breed animals that have the higher alleles. If we're interested in lower allergenic milk, then we may choose the opposite. But this gives us the opportunity to make an informed decision about directions that we may wish to go genetically. Okay, so for additional information on our genetic programs, go to our website. Almost everything that I've presented this morning is public information and is available either on the ADGA website or through adgagenetics.org, which is a cooperative agreement that we have with Gene Dershowitz in Oregon, who puts together summaries of all of the genetic information that we have. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes, Larry?
One question I had, maybe I missed it, was if you use in the test where you're using the DNA.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I'm saying, are you tying, like with the Holsteins, I know you're working with the cattle, are you tying the genomics to your records to increase your accuracy?
At this point, AI studs in the dairy cattle world have been instrumental in doing a lot of this genetic testing and information. And we haven't had that kind of interest yet in dairy goat genetics. As more interest in dairy goat products and dairy goat genetics increases, as well as the meat goat side of things, I think we're going to see a lot more of this happening. Yes?
So this is wonderful data collection that takes an awful lot of effort in a lot of ways. I had two questions about traits and whether there was any kind of cumulative analysis. So specifically, is there, you're taking these records at different ages, is there at any point, is there a measure of total productive lifetime that gets factored into any of the analysis or the selection decisions?
Not in terms of the evaluations. However, in terms of, you talked about productive life in meat goats, and the productive life of dairy goats is very similar. We're looking at 6 to 8 years maximum, and lower than that in a commercial herd. So, we're certainly ahead of the dairy cattle that way. But in terms of the correlation of the linear traits to milk production, yes. There, for instance, rear udder height, rear udder arch, a lot of those things, yes, those correlations have been done. We're about at the stage where we need to reevaluate some of the traits. One of the new traits we're bringing in next year, we've done research on it the last 2 years in the field to see what the range is going to be, and if it's a viable range. A lot of our commercial dairy people have been asking for teat length, and so that's a new trait that we're going to be bringing in as one of the traits. Probably the trait that's going to be dropped out is the shape of the rear udder, because we haven't found that to be necessarily as useful as they thought it might be back in the late 80s.
What about fertility? Is there any record made of the number of kids that they're having and contributions those might make to the bottom line? That's not part of the evaluations at this point. And again, I'm not sure that is going to be. Obviously, it's important to have your good animals. You want to have your good animals be the animals that are contributing to your future genetics. So when they have twin and triplet does, we're just real happy. Or if they have a, nice young buck for you that you made a good breeding with. But at this point, we haven't necessarily been looking at fertility. One of the things that we're looking at, along with, I know the dairy cattle people have been looking at it, is the size of the animals. And I know there's been a lot of criticism in the dairy cattle industry of their type appraisal programs, that the type appraisal has been pushing for big cows that aren't as efficient as a smaller cow. And we've seen, as a judge, over the last 20-some years, I've certainly seen that same trend in the show ring and dairy goats. And I would agree that it's not a healthy trend. We need to, which is another reason why just showing is not the way to look at improving your performance. If you don't look at that along with what happens to a great big goat that goes down on our pasterns as a 2-year-old and can't function in the dairy properly. There may be big goats, and I've certainly had them over the years, that lived easily to be 6, 7 years old and were still productive and weren't down on their pasterns. But again, you have to breed for those things. Our type program helps you to do that, but it has to be correlated with the production side of things so that there is a balance. And a big goat isn't necessarily a more productive goat. So, all of these things, just like your biggest meat goat doesn't, the biggest frame doesn't mean you're going to get the most meat off that goat. No. Other questions?
Yes.
You listed the averages by breed of production. How have those averages changed over the last 5, 10, 20 years?
Well, there have been some changes. We've only, for instance, I'll go back to that slide. There have been some changes. For one thing, we do have more goats on test, so we do have a better database to work with. Nigerian dwarfs and sables have only been in the registry since 2005, so that the data on those two breeds is not, we don't have the historical data that we have on the other breeds. Relative to all of the other breeds in terms of the amount of milk, pounds, the energy corrected milk, the relative positioning of those breeds has not changed significantly. Once in a while you'll have a year where the Alpines may produce a few more pounds of milk than Sonnens, but other than that, and vice versa, those two breeds tend to go back and forth a little bit. The relative positions of the other breeds have not changed.
I have a question for you. This is coming in, I realize you may not have a set answer. As somebody who is in the dairy industry yourself and involved in this, I'm assuming you use some of this in your selection and processing. I know whenever I talk performance data and trying to get people to utilize performance data, they always come back to well, what's in it for me? Can you talk a little bit about, in your own experience, some of the things that you've seen change that you attribute to the use of data in your herd and in other herds?
Sure. Ken's question is, can I kind of look back historically in my own experience and describe some of the changes that I've seen that can be attributed to the use of performance programs? And I started out with dairy goats in 1979 and began participating in performance programs in 1984. At that time, in terms of type evaluations, my herd average was, I don't know, maybe a final score of 82, 81, 82, somewhere in there. Most of my goats, I did have a commercial dairy for several years, and so my emphasis was on production. But, the majority of my does were scoring in the 70s, in that acceptable range. Since I moved to Arizona in 91, I've not had a commercial herd. I kept my best animals when I moved to Arizona in terms of type and production. And my herd averages are now in the upper 80s. And so I can attribute that to the use of these programs, certainly the type program. In terms of production, I haven't always been able to be on DHI test. I breed for a goat that will milk for several years and is not a super productive goat. I've had goats that have milked over 4,000 pounds in a lactation. In my experience, those does have some metabolic issues that I may not wish to perpetuate in my herd, so I would rather breed for an animal that milks around 3,000 pounds, 2,800 to 3,000 pounds, with butterfat and protein levels that are above the breed average. Right now I'm concentrating on developing casein in my herd. And I've been doing my own little experiments with some of my does that I now have that are carrying the casein gene, and comparing the cheese yield at various points in their lactation, just in my own kitchen. But, and milk flavor, protein and fat components. For me, the most important part of being able to use these programs and using these programs, in addition to the satisfaction of seeing the improvement in my own herd, which all of us want to do. You know, costs just as much to feed a poor goat as it does to feed a good one. You might as well feed a good one. And I sell breeding stock. So, you know, many of my customers, not all of them, they also look at show records, and I do show my goats as well. But the majority of my customers want to see the performance information. And it has given value to my kids. And it's something that I know if I'm in a situation where I have a buyer come to me and they want animals with performance information, or they want animals of a certain breed, I can go to people who have performance data, and I can say that this person is willing to offer more money for those animals. If you aren't participating in those programs, you aren't going to be able to always get the kind of money that you would like to get to maybe come close to the break-even point on your animals. So yes, it has made a financial difference to me, but the main important thing to me is to see those animals with a superior genetics designation, to see those animals that are scoring 91, 92, 93. You know, and it's a lot more important to me than having that grand champion designation for them. But again, I grew up with Holsteins and performance hogs, and so I have the genetics that appreciate that too. But from my own experience, when I had the dairy, the production end of it was really important. Components were, but if you don't have animals that can walk in the parlor and stay healthy, particularly feet and legs, front end assembly, mammary systems that are going to hold up over several lactations, you don't have it either. So all those things feed in. Yeah.
And one of the things, just as a comment, you mentioned that you're not trying to get the maximum yield, maximum milk production possible. One of the things I try to tell people is using the data, you can help keep yourself in the range you want to be in.
Right.
And not all, because sometimes if you're not looking at stuff, I've seen people push themselves out of where they need to be due to their environment, due to their management system. So it's.
One of the first linear appraisers to score my herd back in the 80s was Ray Horton, and he was a long-time ADGA judge and classifier and then appraiser, one of the first appraisers that we had. And he had run several commercial dairies in California early on. And at that point, Ray said, "Well, Betty, what are you breeding for?" And I said, "Well, I have this milk market and I want to breed for production." And he said, "You'll be a lot happier if you breed for a 2,500 pound goat in terms of production. You'll have some that'll milk 4,000, you'll have some that'll milk 1,500. But in the long run, you're going to have animals that are going to be productive over a long lifetime." Anyone else? Okay, thank you so much.
The American Goat Federation, AGF, is a nonprofit national association that represents the interests of more than 200 organizations and thousands of producers engaged in the sustainable production and marketing of goat milk, meat, fiber, and grazing services across the United States. This video was produced as part of the educational services of AGF. AGF also supports research projects that will benefit the goat industry by writing letters to accompany grant requests and providing information when requested. The board of directors is made up of representatives of member organizations, individual producers, and industry specialists from all parts of the United States. Director candidates are nominated and serve 3-year terms on the board. AGF is headquartered in West Lafayette, Indiana, and open from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday. Visit our website, AmericanGoatFederation.org, where you will find information about goat management, healthcare, and other resources. While you're on the website, become a member of AGF and help us provide information to goat owners and represent all goat producers by providing information about our concerns and industry needs to government agencies, USDA, and researchers.